Sienna had seen her fair share of chaos, but this was different. As a seasoned firefighter, she was no stranger to danger. Blazing fires, collapsing buildings, and moments where life hung by a thread. But nothing could have prepared her for the day when the ocean itself seemed to turn against her. It all began like any other. The beach was unusually quiet, a slight breeze teasing the edges of the sand. She had parked her SUV just a few feet from the water, thinking nothing of it. The waves were calm, just the usual ebb and flow, and her mind was at ease as she checked her gear. She had been so sure of it. But something wasn't right. The air had a heaviness, an unspoken tension that was building, though she couldn't put her finger on it. Sienna brushed it off at first, telling herself it was just the weather playing tricks on her. It had been a long day, and she needed a quick break. But as she settled back in her seat, she noticed the first sign. The water level was rising faster than it should have been. The tide wasn't supposed to come in this quickly. A small knot of unease formed in her stomach, but she still wasn't prepared for what came next. A loud crash broke her thoughts. The SUV lurched forward. She snapped her head toward the shore, her heart skipping a beat. The waves had suddenly grown, towering over the sand, pulling the water closer, closer to where her car was parked. Sienna's pulse quickened. This wasn't normal. The SUV had barely been out of park when the front wheels began sinking into the wet sand. She slammed her foot on the gas pedal, trying to reverse, but the tires spun uselessly. Panic crept into her veins. The waves kept coming, as if they had a mind of their own. Sienna tried again, her hands shaking as she tried to steer the car to safety. But the water was rising faster now. It was as if the ocean had been waiting for this moment. She pressed harder on the pedal, heart pounding. The SUV slid further, almost as if it were being dragged toward the ocean. For the first time, Sienna felt completely helpless. Suddenly, it was too late. A monstrous wave crashed into the SUV with a force that knocked the vehicle off its course. Sienna's heart stopped for a second as the car tilted, the water reaching higher and higher. The tires were no longer gripping the ground. Before she could react, the SUV was pulled into the ocean. The cold rush of panic flooded her chest as she yanked at the door, but it was no use. The waves were in control now, swallowing the car whole. She jumped out of the SUV, her boots splashing in the rising water, and took a step back, eyes locked on the vehicle that had once been her escape. She felt a chill run through her as the SUV began to float, the water taking it further into the vast, unpredictable sea. Her breath was coming in ragged gasps as she stood frozen, watching her car disappear beneath the waves. How could this be happening? How could she, of all people, be taken by something as simple as the ocean? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her back to reality. It was a message from a colleague at the station. "Sienna, are you all right? We heard about the SUV. What happened?" Her fingers trembled as she typed out a quick response. "It's gone. The ocean took it. I couldn't stop it." She hit send, but the words didn't feel real. She stared at the empty beach in disbelief, the sound of the waves still pounding in her ears. Everything she had was just swept away in an instant. Her mind raced. Was this some kind of sign? Had she been too careless? The ocean, once so peaceful, now felt like a living thing that had chosen her car, her safety, as its victim. Was there something more going on here? She couldn't help but wonder if it was more than just a random accident. But she didn't have the answers, only questions. Time seemed to stretch as she stood there, numb, watching the waves recede, leaving only the distant echoes of the chaos that had just unfolded. The SUV was gone, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the ocean wasn't finished with her, that this wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. And then her phone buzzed again. But this time, the message wasn't from a colleague. It was from an unknown number. "You think you've seen it all, but you've only just begun. The ocean has a way of getting what it wants, and it's not finished with you yet." Her blood ran cold. What did that mean? Who could be sending her these messages? And why now? She had no answers, but she knew one thing for sure. Today had changed everything. She had been forced to face something bigger than herself. And in the pit of her stomach, she felt a terrible certainty. This wasn't the end. The ocean had more in store for her. The question was, what would it take next? The next few hours felt like a blur to Sienna. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what had just happened, but the more she thought about it, the less she understood. She kept replaying the moment in her head, the SUV being pulled by the ocean, the helpless feeling of watching it disappear into the waves. The phone call from her colleague at the station only added to the confusion. "Sienna, we heard what happened. Are you sure you're okay? You're safe, right?" It was a simple question, but the weight of it hit her harder than she expected. She had been trained for emergencies, for chaos, for fire and destruction, but this was different. The ocean had just taken everything from her. She walked along the beach, her boots sinking into the wet sand as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the water. The sky had shifted from gray to a bruised purple, and the wind had picked up again, sending chills down her spine. As she walked, her phone buzzed again. She looked at it, half expecting another message from the same unknown number, but it wasn't. It was a news alert. Shocking footage captures SUV swept into the ocean. Firefighter's vehicle dragged by powerful waves. Sienna's heart skipped a beat. They had caught it on camera, the entire thing. The one thing she never wanted anyone to see. The moment of her failure. The ocean had taken her car, and now it was taking her dignity, her privacy, for the world to see. Her mind raced again. The message from the mysterious number was still fresh in her thoughts. The ocean has a way of getting what it wants. She couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger than just a freak accident was at play. Was this really just a natural disaster, or was there something more behind it? Someone had known about it before it even happened. That thought gnawed at her, making her second-guess everything. The world was watching, and she couldn't control how it was being spun. Sienna's phone buzzed once more, and she hesitated before looking at it. The unknown number again. "You've been marked. The ocean is just the beginning. You'll understand soon enough." Her blood turned to ice. Who was this person? How did they know what had happened? And what did they mean by, "You've been marked"? She gripped the phone tightly, staring at the screen, her mind struggling to process the words. She had never believed in anything supernatural, but this felt different. It felt like someone, something, was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. With no answers and more questions than ever, Sienna returned to her apartment, locking the door behind her as she entered. The silence felt suffocating. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being hunted. She set the phone down on the kitchen counter, taking a deep breath. But as she looked out the window toward the horizon, she saw it, the water shimmering in the distance, as if calling to her. Her stomach churned. It was like the ocean was waiting for her. And this time, it wasn't just after her SUV. It was after her. Sienna couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The messages had continued, each one more cryptic than the last. "The ocean wants what's yours. It's not over yet." The words twisted in her mind, refusing to let go. It was like something was tugging at her, pulling her deeper into a web she didn't understand. As the days went by, the unease only grew. The local news covered the incident relentlessly, replaying the footage of her SUV being swallowed by the waves. Each time she saw it, a sinking feeling filled her chest. Her world had been turned upside down, and now everyone was watching. But the strangest part? The phone calls started. Unknown numbers, no names, just a long pause before the voice on the other end. It was always the same. "You're not safe. You need to leave. It's coming for you next." Every call sent a chill straight down her spine. She had tried blocking the numbers, but they kept coming back, like the tide, relentless and unforgiving. It wasn't just the messages anymore. It was the knowledge that someone, or something, was following her, predicting her every move. It was like the ocean wasn't done with her yet. It was as though it had left something behind, an imprint that wouldn't let her go. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, staring out at the calm horizon, a sudden thought struck her. What if the ocean wasn't just a natural force? What if it was something else? Her mind reeled. She had never been one to entertain such thoughts, but there was something inexplicably wrong. The waves had taken her car, yes, but they hadn't just taken that. They had taken something more. Maybe it was something she had never fully understood, something she couldn't explain. Sienna decided to visit the beach again the next morning. She needed to see it with her own eyes, to understand what had happened, and if there was anything she could do to stop it. As the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, she made her way to the shore, the wind biting at her skin. The sand was still wet from the night before, and the ocean stretched out endlessly before her, calm and serene. Too calm. Standing at the edge of the beach, she stared out at the water, her thoughts racing. "What do you want from me?" she whispered to the ocean, the words barely audible over the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. It felt like she was speaking into an abyss, like her voice would never reach the ocean's depths. Just as she turned to leave, a figure caught her eye, a man standing at the far end of the beach, his silhouette dark against the rising sun. He was watching her, unmoving. Sienna's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know who he was, but she could feel his eyes on her, like he knew exactly what had happened, like he knew what was coming. Without thinking, she started walking toward him, her footsteps leaving impressions in the wet sand. As she got closer, he didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. He just stood there, his back turned to the water. Finally, she called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" He turned slowly, his face hidden in the shadows of his hood. "It's not over," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, as though it was meant only for her. "You've been marked. The ocean is just the beginning." Before she could respond, he turned and walked into the mist, disappearing like smoke in the wind. Sienna froze. What had just happened? Was he real? Had he been watching her all along? The words echoed in her mind. "The ocean is just the beginning." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Sienna stood at the edge of the water, staring out at the endless expanse. The ocean had already taken so much from her, but now it seemed like it was coming for her sanity, her life, and she had no idea how to stop it. The next few days felt like they passed in a haze, each moment slipping by without meaning, just a blur of unanswered questions. Sienna couldn't escape the feeling that the ocean was calling to her, waiting for her to return. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the waves swallowing her SUV whole, pulling it into the depths like it was never meant to stay on land. The eerie voice of the man on the beach replayed in her mind. The ocean is just the beginning. She had to know what that meant, and why it felt like it was consuming her thoughts. She wasn't ready to believe it, but deep down, Sienna knew something was out there, something beyond the waves, something she hadn't yet fully grasped. Then the phone calls started again. This time, they weren't just warnings. They were demands. Every call had the same message, each one more urgent than the last. "You need to leave. They're coming for you. The ocean never forgets." At first, she tried to ignore them, to pretend it was just a twisted joke, but each message came with a strange, undeniable weight, like they knew something she didn't. It was as if the ocean wasn't just a place. It was alive, watching, and somehow it was angry. She tried to block the numbers again, but the calls kept coming. Every time she thought she was safe, another number appeared, another voice whispering the same thing. "The ocean is watching you. It's not over." Each time, the words sank deeper into her, a constant reminder that the waves had only begun to claim what was theirs. And then came the dream. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The ocean, vast and dark, stretched out before her. She was standing at the edge of it, her feet buried in the wet sand. There was no sound, just the immense, suffocating silence that came with the deep. The waves were still now, calm and inviting. But there was something wrong. Something felt off. Sienna turned, and there he was, the man from the beach. His hood still cast in shadows, but she could feel his presence, like he was watching her every move. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, the water behind her began to rise, slow at first, and then faster, surging toward her as though the ocean had become a living thing, reaching for her. She tried to move, to run, but her feet were rooted to the sand. She was trapped, caught in the grasp of the sea. She woke up gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. Her sheets were soaked with sweat, her body frozen with fear. The dream had felt too real. It was as though the ocean itself had spoken to her, pulling her into its depths. The words from the dream echoed in her mind. "The ocean is calling you." Sienna didn't know what to make of it, but she couldn't deny the weight it carried. The strange man, the cryptic messages, the feeling that the ocean was alive and waiting. She felt like she was at the center of something, a storm brewing that she couldn't escape. But how could she fight something she couldn't even understand? The next morning, her nerves were on edge. She couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on anything. She grabbed her phone, half expecting another message, but there was nothing new. Instead, she got a text from a local news station. It was about the footage of her SUV being swept into the ocean. They wanted an interview. Sienna's stomach turned. She had never wanted to be part of the story, but now it seemed like the world was pulling her into it, piece by piece. She had to face the consequences of what had happened. She had to find out what the ocean really wanted, and what she had gotten herself involved in. She didn't have a choice anymore. The ocean had taken her car. It had left her with nothing but questions. And now it was taking her thoughts, her mind too. Whatever it was, whatever force was behind this, she had to confront it. The world had already seen the footage, but what would they see when they saw her next? The next few days felt like they passed in a haze, each moment slipping by without meaning, just a blur of unanswered questions. Sienna couldn't escape the feeling that the ocean was calling to her, waiting for her to return. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the waves swallowing her SUV whole, pulling it into the depths like it was never meant to stay on land. The eerie voice of the man on the beach replayed in her mind. The ocean is just the beginning. She had to know what that meant, and why it felt like it was consuming her thoughts. She wasn't ready to believe it, but deep down, Sienna knew something was out there, something beyond the waves, something she hadn't yet fully grasped. Then the phone calls started again. This time, they weren't just warnings. They were demands. Every call had the same message, each one more urgent than the last. "You need to leave. They're coming for you." The ocean never forgets. At first, she tried to ignore them, to pretend it was just a twisted joke, but each message came with a strange, undeniable weight, like they knew something she didn't. It was as if the ocean wasn't just a place. It was alive, watching, and somehow, it was angry. She tried to block the numbers again, but the calls kept coming. Every time she thought she was safe, another number appeared, another voice whispering the same thing. "The ocean is watching you. It's not over." Each time, the words sank deeper into her, a constant reminder that the waves had only begun to claim what was theirs. And then came the dream. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The ocean, vast and dark, stretched out before her. She was standing at the edge of it, her feet buried in the wet sand. There was no sound, just the immense suffocating silence that came with the deep. The waves were still now, calm and inviting, but there was something wrong. Something felt off. Sienna turned, and there he was, the man from the beach, his hood still cast in shadows, but she could feel his presence, like he was watching her every move. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, the water behind her began to rise, slow at first, and then faster, surging toward her as though the ocean had become a living thing, reaching for her. She tried to move, to run, but her feet were rooted to the sand. She was trapped, caught in the grasp of the sea. She woke up gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. Her sheets were soaked with sweat, her body frozen with fear. The dream had felt too real. It was as though the ocean itself had spoken to her, pulling her into its depths. The words from the dream echoed in her mind. "The ocean is calling you." Sienna didn't know what to make of it, but she couldn't deny the weight it carried. The strange man, the cryptic messages, the feeling that the ocean was alive and waiting. She felt like she was at the center of something, a storm brewing that she couldn't escape. But how could she fight something she couldn't even understand? The next morning, her nerves were on edge. She couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on anything. She grabbed her phone, half expecting another message, but there was nothing new. Instead, she got a text from a local news station. It was about the footage of her SUV being swept into the ocean. They wanted an interview. Sienna's stomach turned. She had never wanted to be part of the story, but now it seemed like the world was pulling her into it, piece by piece. She had to face the consequences of what had happened. She had to find out what the ocean really wanted and what she had gotten herself involved in. She didn't have a choice anymore. The ocean had taken her car. It had left her with nothing but questions. And now it was taking her thoughts, her mind too. Whatever it was, whatever force was behind this, she had to confront it. The world had already seen the footage, but what would they see when they saw her next? The interview with the news station was a disaster from the moment it began. Sienna had thought that confronting the media would help her get control of the situation, that by speaking openly about the incident, she could finally put the strange events behind her. But nothing could have prepared her for the way it spiraled out of control. The reporter, a young man with too much energy and too little tact, started with the usual questions about the incident, her experience, how she felt when the SUV was swept into the ocean. Sienna answered mechanically, her mind still reeling from the mysterious phone calls and the dream she couldn't shake. But then he asked the question that sent a chill down her spine. Do you think there's more to this than just a freak accident? What do you think caused the ocean to pull your car in so quickly? The words hung in the air like a challenge. The camera zoomed in on her face, and for the first time, Sienna realized that it wasn't just the SUV that had been taken. It was her reputation, her sanity, and her control over the situation. The reporters were looking for answers, and they weren't satisfied with the simple explanation that it was just an act of nature. They wanted drama. They wanted a story. Her breath caught in her throat as her heart pounded. The waves, the mysterious figure, the constant phone calls, all of it surged in her mind, fighting for dominance. She knew what she wanted to say. She wanted to scream, to tell them that something was wrong, that the ocean wasn't just an ocean, it was a force, a living, breathing entity, something that had its own will. But how could she explain that without sounding insane? How could she make them believe her? Instead, she said the first thing that came to her mind. I don't know what happened. It was a freak accident. The waves were stronger than I expected. That's all. The reporter pressed on, sensing weakness. Are you sure? People are talking about strange occurrences around the area. There's even some footage from nearby surveillance cameras showing strange ripples in the water before your car was pulled in. Sienna felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. Footage? Ripples? What was he talking about? She hadn't seen anything like that. Her mind scrambled for answers, but the words didn't come. Instead, her throat tightened and her mouth went dry. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever before she finally managed to speak. I don't know about any ripples. I was just there to take a break. The ocean, the waves came out of nowhere. The interview ended abruptly after that, with the reporter wrapping up the segment, clearly unsatisfied with her vague answers. As Sienna walked off the set, her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. The footage, the ripples, the strange man on the beach, the ominous messages, all of it was starting to come together in a way she didn't understand. She felt like she was drowning in it, pulled deeper by something she couldn't see, couldn't explain. She had to know more. Later that evening, as she sat in her apartment, the phone buzzed again. She hesitated, staring at the screen. It was the unknown number. With a deep breath, she opened the message. You didn't tell them everything. You can't hide from it. The ocean knows. Sienna's heart skipped a beat. The ocean knows. What did that even mean? How could the ocean know anything? She had to stop this, to make sense of it all. But as the words flashed on her phone screen, she felt an unsettling chill creep down her spine. The phone rang right after the message, the same unknown number. She answered it without thinking. What do you want from me? She demanded, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. The voice on the other end was barely a whisper. Come to the edge. You've seen the ocean's power, but you haven't seen the truth yet. It's waiting. Before she could respond, the line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. Sienna's hands shook as she gripped the phone, her mind racing. The edge? The truth? What truth? Her head was spinning. Everything, her car, the messages, the strange man, the dream, it was all connected. But how? The fear she had been trying to suppress surged back in full force. Something was coming for her. The ocean had been the first warning, but now it seemed like whatever was behind it was ready to make itself known. Sienna knew one thing for sure. If she didn't figure this out soon, it wouldn't just be her car that was taken. It would be her. Sienna couldn't ignore it anymore. The ocean was calling her. She had never been one to believe in superstitions or anything beyond what she could see and touch. But everything that had happened, the messages, the strange man, the ripples in the water, and now the calls, was something she couldn't just brush aside. Something deep inside her knew that she had to face it head on, even if she didn't fully understand what it was. The message had been clear. Come to the edge. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew she had no choice. The ocean had already taken her car, her safety, her peace of mind. It had shown her that there were things in this world beyond control, beyond understanding. If she didn't find out what was truly going on, she feared she might lose even more. That evening, she drove to the beach again, the same spot where everything had changed. The sky was darkening, and the air felt heavier than usual. She parked her car at the edge of the sand, the familiar sounds of the waves crashing in the distance. But tonight, there was something different. The wind howled, as if it too was waiting for her to make a move. The ocean stretched out before her, dark and vast, the moonlight dancing on the water's surface in a way that seemed almost unnatural. Sienna took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, her boots sinking into the wet sand. The night was silent except for the rush of the waves. She felt the weight of the ocean, the unspoken tension that seemed to pull her closer. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet as she walked toward the water's edge, her heart pounding with every step. She had come here for answers, but what if she didn't find what she was looking for? What if she found something she couldn't escape? Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him again. The figure in the hooded cloak, standing just at the edge of the water, his face hidden in shadows. He didn't move, just stood there, like he had been waiting for her. Sienna froze. There was no turning back now. You came, he said, his voice low and gravelly, like the ocean itself was speaking through him. You were meant to. What is this? Sienna asked, her voice trembling. What's happening to me? To the ocean? The man turned slowly, his hood falling back just enough for Sienna to see his face, if only for a split second. It was not quite human. His eyes were dark, hollow, almost as if they held the weight of the ocean itself. Sienna took a step back, fear creeping into her veins, but she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot like the ocean had already claimed her. This is only the beginning, he said, his lips barely moving. You were never meant to escape. The ocean has chosen you. Sienna's heart raced. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The waves around them began to rise, growing in intensity, crashing harder against the shore. The man's figure began to blur, his presence almost fading into the darkness of the night. Why me? Sienna whispered, barely able to breathe as the ocean seemed to pull at her very soul. You have always belonged to it, the figure replied. The ocean doesn't forget, and neither do you. Before Sienna could ask another question, the figure vanished into the mist. The waves surged violently in the distance, and she felt the pull of the water like it was calling her, dragging her toward the edge of the world. The wind howled louder, and for a moment she thought she could hear something else, a whisper, faint but clear. You can't run. The ocean has already marked you. Sienna stumbled back, her legs shaky, her breath shallow. She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the wet sand as the waves crashed behind her, chasing her with every step. It was as if the ocean itself was chasing her, unwilling to let go. By the time she reached her car, her heart was hammering in her chest. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. She had barely driven away when she felt it, an overwhelming presence, a sense that something was following her, even as she sped away from the beach. The ocean hadn't just taken her car. It hadn't just stolen her peace of mind. It had left a mark on her, a mark she couldn't escape. Sienna wasn't sure what had just happened, but one thing was certain. The ocean hadn't finished with her. It had only just begun. And now, There was nowhere to run.